Hello and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Welcome to the third session of our Fractures Internationalist teachings. I'm your host, Shaun Matsheza, and I'll be moderating today's panel. In the background, we have my colleagues Nick Buxton and Jess Graham, who are doing the background work, and of course, the entire machinery of the Transnational Institute that has come together to give this session on international, trying to understand what is going on in the world, trying to give us a bit of understanding of, it seems, the entire world system we're living in is in a system is in a process of change. What can we do to understand it? What are the fractures that we're seeing, and what are the opportunities those fractures are giving us? Please introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us where you're coming from. Tell us where you're joining us from. And do feel free to introduce yourself and have a conversation with others in the chat. The Fractures Internationalist teaching is a series of 8 different deep dives into specific aspects of dynamics that are changing in the global order. Today's session is going to be trying to understand, do we still live in a neoliberal world? And bringing this to you is the Transnational Institute, of course, and our partners that we're working with, the Asia-Europe People's Forum, the Center for the AIDC, Alternative Information and Development Center, the Global Network of Movement Lawyers, and Know for Images. All of these organizations are coming together to help us understand what's going on in this particular moment. And all of this work takes capacity and it takes money. So if you feel compelled to support our work, please do support these different organizations that are trying to really give us an understanding of what's going on. We've got an amazing lineup of speakers today who are going to be giving us their insights and helping us to understand what are these fractures in the global order and what opportunities do those fractures bring for us as movements, bring for us to bring about political and economic change to achieve justice and equity for everyone. And I would like to remind everyone that you can ask questions to our speakers in the Q&A part of the Zoom. And you can also have a conversation amongst yourselves and share relevant links or relevant information in the chat. Now to introduce our speakers, who I will immediately ask to please speak slowly, because we've had people worry that they can't understand. But if you do have trouble understanding the speakers, please, there is a show captions button that you can press, and that will help you to understand, to follow all that is happening. So we've got a great lineup of speakers today, and I'll introduce them now, starting with Quinn Slobodian, who is a professor of international history at the Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. His books, which have been translated into up to 10 languages, include Crack Up Capitalism, Market Radicals, and the Dream of a World Without Democracy, and most recently, Hayek's Bastards, Race, Gold, IQ, and the Capitalism of the Far Right. He's a 2025 Guggenheim Fellow, and unfortunately, he has to leave us at the top of the hour, so I'll be front-loading a bit of our discussion today so that we can get the most of his insights before he has to go. If you have questions for him as he's making his presentations, please quickly put them in the Q&A so that we can refer to them. Second, we've got Daniel Chavez, who is a senior researcher at TNI and part of the Public Alternatives Program. He cut his activist teeth at the United Federation of Mutual Aid Housing Cooperatives in Uruguay before joining TNI, where he's worked on energy, participatory democracy, and democratizing public enterprises. He's the author of, among other books, Rethinking the Public, State, Society, and Basic Services in Latin America. He is also coordinator of TNI's Global Green Industrial Policy Lab. And our third speaker is Anita Gurumurthy, who is a TNI associate and founding member and executive director of IT for Change in India, where she leads research and advocacy on data and AI governance, platform regulation, and feminist frameworks on digital justice. She serves as an expert on various bodies, including the United Nations Secretary General's 10-member group on technology facilitation, the Council of the Platform Cooperative Consortium at the New School in New York, and has been on the Paris Peace Forum's working group on algorithmic governance. To really ground all of this in TNI's work is my colleague, Sofia Scasserra, who I'm going to introduce in detail when she comes in to respond to our discussants. But first, we want to understand where you're coming from. All the participants, hello and welcome again, everyone who's just joined us from all over the world. We want to understand what you're thinking as well. So we've got a poll that we've put up, and we would like you to please respond to the poll. We know you might want to answer to choose more than one of the responses, but we really want to get a more refined sense of the sentiment around this topic we're talking about today. So, has Trump, COVID, and the 2008 crisis put the nail in the coffin of neoliberalism? So please choose one option that reflects the strongest of your views. Just choose the one that you think really captures what you think. Yes, neoliberalism is finally dead or dying. Is that what's happening? Or no, neoliberalism has just been re-articulated and is now tied to the far right. Or maybe it depends where. In some arenas or regions, it's as strong as ever. In others, it's weak and delegitimized. What do you think from where you're coming from? Or are we in an in-between moment where neoliberalism, state capitalism, and new ideologies are fighting it out? You might want to say you really don't know. That's fine, or none of the above, but please choose one option that gets us to really understand where you stand, because this helps us also in crafting the conversation to be the most useful and also the most insightful for everyone who's participating. So just a minute for you to quickly look at the poll and make a choice. I can already see very few people think neoliberalism is finally dead or dying. So a luta continua, I suppose. A few more seconds. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much for those who have voted. This helps us to understand exactly where everyone is coming from. And so to get into the meat of it, Quinn, I'll start with you. You've seen what the audience thinks in the poll. It seems people think neoliberalism is just being rearticulated and now simply tied to the far right. That seems to be the most prevalent response. You've written many books on different threads of neoliberalism. And so what do you think? Are we witnessing an end to neoliberalism? Is it just being rearticulated, or is it the emergence of a particular thread of neoliberalism? And what are the implications of what we see happening for working people?
Yeah, small questions to start it off. I think that I'll probably, first of all, I want to say thank you so much to TNI. I think I did our first seminar with you all in like first months of COVID, and it was a great reminder to me how digital communication, however minimal, can also create these wonderful connections and conversations across great distances that would otherwise be practically impossible. So just hats off to the wonderful work you all are doing. To the question, I always find it helpful when dealing with this question, neoliberalism, to begin with this kind of disclaimer, the kind of the way that people who are talking on a podcast will say, like, this should not constitute investment advice. Neoliberalism is understood in 4 different ways, at least. And I think it helps these kind of conversations to start by laying them out. One way people talk about neoliberalism is a kind of era of history. So people say, when did neoliberalism begin? When will it end? You know, that was sort of in one of the questions here, like, is the neoliberal world dying? Something like that. So it's a period of time. Another way it gets used is a kind of bundle of policy ideas. So the Washington consensus model, right? You have deregulation, liberalization, privatization down the list. And you can then look at countries and say, how neoliberal are they? How many of these things on the laundry list have they checked off? So that tends not to be a grand statement about, like, is neoliberalism over? But it'd be a question of, like, is neoliberalism being rolled out or rolled back in this country or that country, in this sector or that sector? A third way it gets used, only to complicate matters, is as a kind of way of thinking about ourselves. So people will say things like, God, why am I being so neoliberal right now? I'm too focused on my follower count or my CV. I should think more collectively. So that is a kind of form of subjectivity or self-understanding. But a fourth way of thinking about it, and this is actually tends to be the way that I approach it, is as a kind of intellectual movement. So in the 1930s, for the first time, people got together and said, we are neoliberals. We are defending the flame of economic liberty against collectivists on the right and the left. People who we might have heard of, Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, Ludwig von Mises, and they end up having this conversation that often ends up going straight into politics, working with the Margaret Thatchers, the Ronald Reagans, the Augusto Pinochets over the decades. And so that's another way to talk about neoliberalism, is what fix do people think is necessary for capitalism at any given time? How can, as I understand neoliberalism, capitalism be defended from democracy at different moments of international economic integration? And so that answer changes over the decades. So the same people who might have supported multilateral trade agreements in the 1980s might, in the year 2015, be part of movements that are trying to smash up the WTO or get out of the EU. It can be literally the same people. So those very neoliberals, in that sense, I guess I would side more with the neoliberalism has fused with the far right argument that in the 1990s, many people on the right and conservatives feared that globalization was being taken over by progressives. They thought that environmentalists, anti-racists, and feminists, this is all crazy, by the way, but they thought it was somehow being, they had taken over the international organizations. And so now you needed to fight against them. And what we saw with Brexit, Trump, Alternative for Germany, to Bolsonaro, Milei, are alliances between people who are mostly interested in economic freedom and capital security, willingly joining hands with people more interested in ethno-nationalism, blood and soil, pronatalism arguments to fight the left, which they think is, holding on as still persistent. So that's the struggle moment we're in right now, I think. Neoliberalism, if you understand it as the protection of capitalism against democracy, is finding new allies and is finding new ways to dig in and defend itself against, system threatening challenges like climate change and social movements. And what outcome from those new kind of alliances will emerge, I think, is something we're still waiting to find out.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Quinn. Right on to Anita. Anita, you've seen the poll as well. And you've long worked in challenging big tech in India and globally. So big tech is a big thing right now from what we're seeing. And how is digitalization and the tech oligopoly how are they shaping neoliberalism and the power of capital versus labor, as well as, of course, gender relations as well?
Thanks very much. And it's a pleasure to be here, as always. I think that we all know quite well by now, with 2 decades of enslavement to gadgets and what have you, that digital capitalism works to normalize a form of modern slavery, right? There are feudal digital lords, and as several people have argued, we've noted since the 2008 financial crisis that our economic system has fundamentally changed. Cloud, big data, digital platforms, these constitute the land of this new era, controlled, of course, by a handful of oligarchs. So what has really changed in terms of power structures is not only the fact that power is concentrated and consolidated in few actors, but the fact that our means of communication and our means of production have come together, right? So digital technologies. So you had the printing press, and you actually had, you organized your forces of production in the factory, right? But today, they have come together. And this, I think, marks a certain point of departure in the way in which we should be understanding power. And this, while it mirrors the feudal structure of old, it also is slightly different. For instance, our tryst with the market paradigm, we could say, has gone woefully wrong, because the turn that we see, as the previous speaker pointed out, is a turn towards neoliberalism, right? So, and it didn't start now, but it really, really hit home very hard through the announcement in January by Mark Zuckerberg that third-party fact-checking units are going to be shut down, content policies are going to be simplified, and old-fashioned ideas of regulating free speech are going to be out of the window. And instantly, of course, several people lost their jobs. Just across the border, 2,000 people lost their jobs in the content industry in Canada, and no one really knows how many people lost their jobs in the global south, because we are not counting. Meta, of course, retains the right to take down content that's not fitting with its community standards and ad policies, which basically means that you retain you arrogate to yourself the right to control the public sphere. And in a podcast around the same time, Mark also called for more masculine energy. And he said culture should celebrate masculinity a bit more. So I would like to take you a little bit back in time to this conference. And I'm glad that my previous speaker pointed to this kind of the pot in which all this was cooking, about a couple of decades ago. So in this conference called Libertopia in 2010, Peter Thiel grandly declared that, political ideology may not win elections, but technology is the incredible alternative to politics. This is 2010. And technology is the unilateral alternative to politics. And of course, we very well know what Peter Thiel's views are on sexual assault. And if you don't, please go and read it up. And of course, he is the biggest funder in Palantir. And, all of the US government's backbones, right? Health, defense, civilian agencies, projects and programs like Immigration OS, and the IRS data projects in the US now. So as the popular aphorism goes, the more things change, the more they seem to be the same, right? Or not. As feminists would argue, we are at an inflection point that seems particularly bad, but the slippage has been coming. And what Latin American feminists have called de-democratization is what we've been witness to, at least in the past 20 to 30 years. And this is when the consensus on meta-narratives of progress, has broken down to a point, as they say in India, we don't know whether to laugh or to cry, right? So this tragic comedy in Trumpism is perhaps a sheath that we need to uncover to point to the tech oligarchy and its profound tragedies. Our research at ID for Change in 2019 and 2020, and I'll plug it in after I've spoken, on political speech on Twitter, and we systematically coded about 18,000 mentions on Twitter. It shows how misogyny and sexism are not a bug in the code, but a built-in feature of capitalist platform design. Virality, amplification, and falsehood are based on sensationalism, and the normalization of these cultures promotes an alarming servility and narcissism. To date, Silicon Valley's market ideologies have been referred to variously as libertarian, techno-deterministic, long-termist, transhumanist, and what have you. But the long and short of it, for our purposes, is that it all adds up to imperialism on new ships, and what Timnit Gebru says is rooted in an Anglo-American eugenics tradition of the 20th century. The very same AI cultures you can see back then in animated eugenists of the past. Racism, xenophobia, classism, ableism, sexism, and all of that's going into building this grand project called artificial general intelligence. All of us on that race. But let's remember one thing, and I'm concluding. By 2050, 40% of children and young people will be in Africa. By 2050, 15% will be in India, and that makes about 55%. And today, most of these younger generations, and people in these regions, in South Asia and in Africa, live in high precarity. They are part of the shadow economies in gigs that don't mean anything, in jobs that de-skill and alienate, in a trap that will lead to more dispossession. What I want to say, therefore, is we really need to look at where all of this started, a tech culture in California, the high citadels of Silicon Valley, where a naive and misleading narrative of about 30 years ago today is really holding us hostage. And in fact, presenting the climate crisis to us as something that can be solved only if we integrate technologies very well, only if we integrate artificial intelligence into energy conservation and what have you. So there is this misconception that the Earth is a datafied planet, and the datafied planet, through the magic of AI, can deliver us. And this power of data that drives the oligarchic nexus is pre-Trump in many, many ways. And the USTR, the trade rep, has always stood up for big tech, always stood up for America's imperialism. And today, the National Trade Estimate Report marks a troubling regression in the shameful tradition of using US trade policy to undermine democracy the world over. Everything that we do in our countries for policy autonomy and for sovereignty is labeled a barrier, a trade barrier. And so what we are going to see is these changes and the cascading ripples. We have to watch out for China and what kind of economic aggression that China comes up with in its own reciprocal tariffs. The TikTok deal, for instance, the banning of export of rare earth minerals, and how all of this needs to really be watched out for. And our fight so far against the liberal international order were about insisting that rules must apply fairly to the realization of structural justice. The difference today is that there are no rules in the digital space. There's only a discourse of openness. We're all welcome. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anita. Quite a lot to take in there. And I think there will be multiple other changes going on in the digital space. And if there are any questions that you have for Anita, please put them in the Q&A. I can imagine there's a lot of stuff that's been triggered there. And it's good that you mentioned China, because I think this has already been part of the previous conversations we had, looking at the changing geopolitics and the changing international order. And Daniel, I think, has a bit of insight in there on that as well. Daniel, you've long examined state corporations at a time when their role was largely ignored. And in recent times, there's much more focus now on state corporations and state-led capitalism, especially since COVID-19 and with the unprecedented economic rise of China. So to what extent is state capitalism replacing neoliberalism? Is that what we're seeing? And what are the implications of that for working people?
Thank you, Shaun. Your question includes several important sub-questions that will require a very careful and detailed dissection of some concepts, such as state capitalism, for instance. But we only have a few minutes, and I've been careful about that. So I will address only the surface of the big question. And I'm very happy that I go after Quinn and Anita, because they refer to some key ideas that are going to be implicit in my response. So let's begin with the alleged replacement of neoliberalism by other economic or political model. Is neoliberalism dead? I saw the result of the poll, and I agree with more responses that neoliberalism is far from that. And Quinn already brilliantly explained the many possible understandings of neoliberalism. But whatever understanding of neoliberalism we have, it's clear that this model, this system is not collapsing, but it has clearly entered a phase of decay, with many and profound contradictions and crises visible in both the global south and the global north. We can time the start of that phase to the 2007, 2008 financial crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, the worsening climate emergency and the need for public responses, the state-driven expansion of China, and many other factors. But all these factors have exposed the failures and cracks of market fundamentalism. Through our research at TNI on public ownership, public services, and industrial policy, we have documented how neoliberal dynamics remain dominant in many sectors, while the state has taken a more prominent role in others. I belong to the Gramscian current of the Latin American left, and I think we can see this contradictory moment as a component of what Gramsci would define as interregnum, meaning that the old neoliberal configuration is dying, but the post-neoliberal order, whatever it can be, cannot yet be born. Your second sub-question referred to the implication of all this for working people. I think this interregnum presents both dangers and possibilities and opportunities for working people. And I really appreciate, Shaun, that you refer to the concept of working people, because I think we need a more nuanced understanding of class, particularly in the global South. I come from a Marxist tradition, and there have been so many, maybe too many, abstract discussion about the concept of class. I used to be a follower of Eric Olin Wright, writing on class. And all these approaches focus on exploitation and domination through control over economic resources. And I would say that all these approaches remain useful, but they require adaptation to the specific realities of Latin American, African, and Asian societies after the implementation of neoliberalism, which has been implemented for 5 decades already. So it's not a little time. We must remember that in the global South, the formal proletariat constitute only a small portion of the working people, with the so-called informal sector representing up to 80% of employment in several Latin American countries, and even more in many African countries. So this very complex class configuration has profound political implications. I think we need to talk about labor and jobs. This is crucial. For instance, when we try to conceptualize the significance of industrial policy in the global South, as we are trying to do now at TNI, we also need new organizational forms that go beyond the traditional structure and scope of trade unions. And I'm saying this being part of the trade union movement and being a very big fan of trade unions. We need new type of class alliances, which must bridge not only contradictory class location, using one of Eric Olin Wright's key concepts, but also the rural-urban and the formal-informal divides. And I think we need to talk about state capitalism. I'm not going to engage because of time, and also because I'm not interested in a very abstract or academic discussion about the meaning of state capitalism. I don't really like the concept. I think it's an empty signifier because it's too ambiguous and it can refer to many different social formations. Some people use it to refer to the Chinese style of development with strong state intervention within capitalist property relation. Other people refer to social democratic configurations within a predominantly capitalist framework, especially as we can see it in a few countries of Latin America, or they use it to refer to state ownership of key industry via strong, large, and strong public enterprises. I'm 5 minutes, so I will try to go fast. We must reject, I think, the simplistic dichotomy between the state and the market, and we should recognize that even during extreme neoliberalism, the state remains essential to capitalist accumulation. Our TNI Frontiers of Capital team always remind us about that and the capture of liberal democratic institutions in the context of neoliberalism. Nevertheless, regardless of how much we like or dislike the concept of state capitalism, it is clear that the state is taking a stronger role globally. We can see the resurgence of industrial policy in the global north. We can refer to what happened during the Biden administration, the IRA, the CHIPS Act. We can talk about what is happening in Europe with the European Green Deal and the European Industrial Green Deal. But we can also refer to the return of the developmentalist left in some Latin American countries, including my own country, Uruguay, and we can see the continuation of state-led industrial development in China and parts of Asia. So for working people, these implications are very contradictory. It can mean a potential for increased and better employment and economic stability, but it can also mean the risk of authoritarian disciplination of labor and intensified extraction. I think that without democratic control, state capitalism, however, whatever definition of this concept we offer, can become state-facilitated exploitation, as we can see in China. So very briefly, to finalize, I would like to remind everybody that for us in Latin America, this discussion is not new. Neoliberalism was first implemented in Chile under the Pinochet coup that began in 1970. And Quinn was referring to this new alliance between the proponent of neoliberalism and the far right. This in Latin America is not new. The Chicago Boys happened during the Pinochet regime. And this week I was reading a book that was published in 2003 by Claxo. It's called La Trama del Neoliberalismo, The Plot of Neoliberalism, which engaged exactly with the same question of today's webinar. And I would like to finalize with a quote from the Mexican sociologist Pablo Gonzalo Casanova, who already in 2003 said that the challenge is not merely replacing neoliberalism, but finding something truly new that avoids the pitfall of previous experiences, which proved insufficiently liberating, insufficiently socialist, and insufficiently democratic. I think this observation is still very valid for today in 2025. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Danielle. There are very interesting links to most of the stuff that Danielle has mentioned and also from our previous speakers in the chat. Some of it will be shared in the after email for this session, but please also share any links that you might have in the chat. But also if you have questions for our discussants, please put them in the Q&A. And it's great that you already mentioned this long arc of the fight against neoliberalism, Danielle. This was 2003, you mentioned this book, and today here we still are trying to find a way to get out of this neoliberal trap, essentially. So maybe let's ask the audience as well, everyone who's listening, let's have another poll, because we need to understand and come together. How can progressive forces best defeat neoliberalism and its even more reactionary alternatives that we're seeing popping up everywhere? So we're going to have a poll. Just choose the one option that most resonates with what you think. Should we better develop a clear and robust economic alternative program, as Danielle says, that we should have a better alternative that solves the issues that we've seen with this current setup? Do we keep the focus on the oligarchs and corporations that benefit from neoliberalism and its reactionary alternatives? Is that where we focus? Or do we develop a clearer strategy for a democratic state-led economic transformation? Maybe the success story of China is the way to go for everyone. Do we build community alternatives that don't depend on state-led transformations? Or perhaps, to quote an unlikely fellow, is politics and economics downstream of culture? Should we focus on cultural change to undo the deeper roots of neoliberalism? Please choose in the poll, and this will help us really guide us as we proceed in the next part of our session. Someone says they don't see the first and second options in the poll as mutually exclusive. Yeah, indeed, there may be overlaps in all the different answers. Just please choose the one that most resonates with you. We're not going for a super scientific understanding, but more really just capture the vibe, so to speak, to see where's the energy going? Where do people stand in relation to this topic? And already I can see that many people agree with the Socratic idea that the best way to bring about change is not to spend time fighting the old, but building the new. Option one, better develop a clear and robust economic alternative program. That's what I'm seeing as the winner as the polling closes in 3, 2, 1. Yes. So, Quinn, let's come back to you. Here's our poll. People say let's build and better develop a clear and robust economic alternative program. So how should social movements navigate this moment in terms of strategy, tactics, messaging? With the disruptive show that we're seeing with Milei and Trump, you know, they're taking over part of the anti-globalization critique that the progressive left has long had, but they're doing it for very different purposes. What should be our response there as the global left?
Yeah, no, I think that, you need to look at it obviously contextually and conjuncturally. And the interesting thing about the settlement of the 1990s, let's just focus on the WTO. The creation of the WTO in 94, 95 was a curious moment where US power was so strong that they felt it was not diminishing their power to give over even nominally some of their sovereignty to a world court for the global economy in Geneva, effectively, right? So the WTO locked in certain parts of American competitive advantage for sure, especially to Anita's great points about tech. It globalized intellectual property protections in a way that had not been globalized before. So it grabbed the cutting edge of certain kinds of pushes into things like tech, software, apparel that would become dominant in the US economy in the 21st century. But at some level, it did also make the US accountable to critics internationally. So remember that for global South countries, specifically for poor countries, they were presented with very poor options. It was either remain completely exposed to American arbitrary will, or take this bargain and enter the sullied arrangement of the WTO, in which at least you can take them to court, even if you probably will lose, and if the overall bargain works against you. So it was a kind of compromised relationship that overall I think was negative, and I was, my loyalties were with the protesters in 1999 in Seattle. So to see that now dismantled effectively by the Trump administration, Trump 1 and now Trump 2, incidentally, Biden agreed to, shouldn't be seen, as a victory by the left, because all it means is that the American hegemon decided that it wasn't even going to give that sliver of its sovereignty away anymore. That's what the new arrangement means. It just means now it's back to pure American unilateralism. And there's no victory there. The only victory you could see maybe is that it opens up now enforced possibility for reconstructing a better form of legalized globalization, a kind of globalization minus USA, as it makes itself a kind of untrustworthy bad actor. And parts of that are already starting to come into place, right? Not necessarily ones we want to cheerlead. So like the EU Mercosur agreement, about which Danielle would have a lot more to say than me, is not exactly our vision of alternative globalization in action, but it's a sign that the dismantlement of the international architecture by the United States actually creates openings for the reassembly of an alternative form of architecture by the non-United States. So I think that the question of what is to be done depends on where you're sitting. In the United States, obviously building some kind of credible left populist alternative that does not take tips from, relatives who used to work at Uber and default to language of saving democracy in the last minute, the way Kamala Harris did, but instead presents something like an AOC Bernie Sanders type program, is the matter of the day in the US. But outside the US, I think there is an opportunity to create regional forms of cooperation, even international forms of cooperation minus USA, that could actually roll out more defensible versions of a trade architecture and a trading system. And then if you're lucky enough, the very few of us to be in countries with left-wing governments, as in the Spanish case, then they are doing very interesting things about using the Constitution to introduce more worker control on corporate boards. There are bright spots around the world, and I think it's a good time also not to get hyper-focused as people who, as for myself living in the US, on the American drama, but also realize that things are happening at other parts of the world that are sometimes working in totally different directions. So just internationalism in general remains, I think, essential, especially in these dark domestic moments.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Quinn. Let's come to you, Anita. Big tech. Big tech is a big deal right now. So what alliances, strategies, and tactics are needed to bring down big tech? Because, can we even do it? Right now, we're on Zoom. We're dependent on their tools for our infrastructure. How do we go about this?
Where there is a Goliath, there is a David, many Davids maybe. But I think, I just want to remark on the polls, at the outset. Two sentiments that I saw coming, one of which is we should not be wasting our time with the current order, opposing it. And that begs the question, is there even an alternative for people in precarity? So, if you really look around in my city, the city is really crumbling, but, people will really have to get up in the morning and go about their livelihoods. And this, I think, is partly because of the way in which inequality has really become extreme, right? So you just have to cope. And even as you want to imagine the alternative, what you also see is the public sector is being hollowed out. So the second question as to, let's go with community alternatives and let's not depend on the state. I think that's a very complex question when we talk about big tech. We already noted that, there's always structural power, right? There are institutions and there's structural power. And therefore, we really need to look at systems and systemic structures. What we see with big tech is that structural power is converted to infrastructural power, right? So they control the very society in which we all belong. So to that extent, this kind of scaffolding, our grammar of interconnections, our production systems, our distribution systems. So to that extent, I think what we need are a new kind of public goods regime. And that cannot be organized by communities alone because of the tragedy of the anti-commons. And for those of us who are interested in economics, the tragedy of the anti-commons is a situation where a resource is not utilized well because there are too many owners and they have the right to exclude others. And this leads to a certain breakdown at the collective level of coordination and resource utilization. Obviously, I'm talking about data, right? So there's data everywhere. And if the problem of tuberculosis has to be solved through open science, it would be ideal if we could pull the data of different public hospitals, into a trust and embark on building a model for generic pharma. But actually, what we need, therefore, is to really look at the way public goods can be created, public value can be created. So this is the challenge before us today. And I will, in no particular order, think aloud with all of you. All of us are grappling with the need for solutions. So this is really no prescription. It just comes from a position of reflection and humility. The question is, how do we reinvent the multilateral order, right? So here I want to come up with a word of caution. I think all of us are really left with very little option other than to go for the low-hanging fruit. And that is, for instance, in the current debates that we see, and very soon we will have the Financing for Development conference in Spain, we actually see that this question about wealth distribution and inequality studies, is really throwing up this idea that we have to have fiscal justice, we have to have taxation justice. Well, that's important, and that's really, really something where the left and the right and everybody else on that spectrum would perhaps agree, and a handful will not agree, which is why in the UN, the tax convention has overwhelming support of many countries. This particular focus on wealth redistribution is not enough. We actually see that this does nothing to the oligarchy, right? So actually, we really need to understand the problem and understand that it's not enough to valorize the wealthy, take some of their wealth and give it away, which is already happening through capitalism, right? So we really need to, through coalitions, and one of which many of us here from TNI and others, for instance, Sofia, we're part of, is the Global Digital Justice Forum. We've been articulating the need for human rights that are adequate to the digital paradigm, to reclaim the internet as a global communications commons, to have a just international economic order based on the principle of digital non-alignment, right? It's an old idea, but it can be embraced again, and a sustainable digital transition that really safeguards the human rights of future generations, which means you're not trying to do greenwashing. One of the things I think is very important is to work with ideas of tech crimes, to work with ideas of how technology companies can be held responsible for crimes against humanity, hold them culpable, hold them liable, and go beyond due diligence frameworks, which are a waste of time. We're actually talking about a statistic I want to give you from the Worker Info Exchange, from James Ferrer's work. The report of the Worker Info Exchange estimates that public data deficits conceal wage theft of euro 1.9 billion from drivers alone. And if you actually look at all of the platform economy, you can imagine how much that wage theft will be. So we are talking about a few monopoly players. I think I draw inspiration from worker power, the way, you know, this workers in the content companies, content moderation factories in Kenya stood up against some source. Unfortunately, in a race to the bottom, the factory shifted to Ghana, right? We have to look at platform cooperativism, right, as a model. And here again, I would really call for a productive and important alignment between the community and the public sector. We can actually redefine the state and define our own versions of the public sector, but we need public models for a positive world beyond big tech. And a last few comments. I think we should watch the courts and we should watch what's happening with the competition authorities. And this is important not only in the US, where the US Justice Department is pushing for radical measures, but in a country like mine, where OpenAI has been taken to court by a consortium of 21 news agencies, just on copyright, right? And I completely agree with Quinn that intellectual property continues to haunt us. Trade secrets, data is held as a trade secret. It's nonsense because that data actually belongs to us. And how can you hold it as a trade secret? But that's the case. And therefore, I think we also have to look at national level responses. I can really look at many countries, Indonesia, just recently, just yesterday, the UK, when the US and UK trade deals are being discussed, the UK refused to budge on digital services taxes, right? Similarly, today, India has spoken about how it is going to complain to the WTO that it's going to issue retaliatory tariffs if the US doesn't budge. So there is a role, I think, for a kind of nationalism, which is problematic, but where we really have to have a multiplicity of maybe fragmented strategies to attack the Goliath, while we imagine and claim alternatives. So 2 takeaways: digital non-alignment and small is beautiful. We don't need big AI. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anita. I'm taking away this one, and you will probably hear it in the next upcoming webinars. Where there's a Goliath, there is a David, or there are multiple Davids, and they can take it down. Thank you so much. Quinn is going to have to leave in a bit, so I'm going to just take this moment to ask you really quickly. There's a question in the Q&A, which is there any material component to your ideational approach on neoliberalism? Are these intellectual movements randomly floating in history, acting in line with their beliefs? I don't know exactly how close to that question. I would have liked to have a bit more detail on that question, but I'm just asking it just in case. And good also if you could talk about, before you leave, Quinn, what fractures can we see in the neoliberal far right that could be broken open and provide possibilities for us to bring in the light, so to speak?
Yeah, so both are good questions. And I actually responded to the one in the Q&A directly because I wasn't sure I'd have time to. But the short answer to that is that part of the challenge, I think, with this term neoliberalism is sometimes it's taken to me synonymous with global capitalism as such. And so if you say, you know, when did neoliberalism begin, you then have to both provide a kind of structural material explanation and an ideological one. And I actually think it's just overburdens the category. So I think that, you know, it's essential to do structural analyses that talk about, you know, the relative rise of the service sector, the financialization of the economy, the precaritization of the workforce, the way that laws protect certain kinds of capital and value and leave others vulnerable. Obviously, all of that's essential. And I don't think the history of the 21st and 20th century is just a history of debates between a small number of people. However, and this gets to the question from Nick about fractures in the far-right neoliberal alliance. I think it can be helpful to look at ideology because it often is the way that curious alliances are cemented together. So I think that if you look at far-right parties, and this is certainly true in Europe, it's certainly true in the UK and the US and across Latin America, I think I take Danielle's point that the collaboration of the far-right with neoliberals is hardly new in the Latin American context. It's very common, if you look at the origin story of parties of the far right, that you have, on the one hand, people who are mostly interested in things like anti-tax policy, shrinking the state, getting rid of state spending, rolling back state, working with people who are more like ethno-nationalists, who are more interested in like blood and soil type protection of the national family. And they often then go into a coalition together. And over a few election cycles, inevitably, the welfare chauvinist side starts to win more influence inside of the party. This was true with the Alternative for Germany party. It was true with many other parties of the far right, Swedish Democrats and others. The National Front is also another example of this. So it's always an uneasy alliance between neoliberals and the far right, actually. They're both getting something out of it. But if you're mostly interested in economic freedom, then, and your partners are saying like, we need more welfare and more spending to increase, the population size, then there's already a potential fracture in that alliance. And we've seen this already in the MAGA case quite often, right? I mean, on immigration, for example, is it hard borders, American jobs for Americans, or can you make an exception for skilled workers on H-1B visas? Or can you make another exception for people that have $5 million to buy a gold card, regardless of their place of origin or their race? Those are pretty violent disputes between the hard nativist camp and then the big tech neoliberals who are willing to go along with the MAGA locomotive. So I think for me, that's a place where you can press, right? I think if they betray their promises to their voters enough times, and they keep on saying, we are going to soften competition, we're going to soften the effects of global capitalism, and keep lying. And that's so far what they're doing. They're just lying. They're saying we're going to reindustrialize the Midwest, or we're going to introduce a care economy for workers, but they're not. Actually, Biden was the only person who actually tried to do that unsuccessfully, but that's what 4 years of Bidenomics was trying to do. Then I think there must be a question of the messenger. If you can find a messenger who can expose hypocrisy effectively enough, then that always fragile coalition between neoliberals just trying to, keep the people down, and then far right actors who are trying to, keep the globalists at bay. I don't think it's a stable coalition, and I think it actually is something that the left needs to be focused on at the level of ideology to say, where are the inconsistencies? Where can we peel off people from the sympathy that the far right gets for often invalid reasons? And sometimes efforts like this, for example, in Germany with Sarah Wagenknecht, her attempt was to break with the left party and adopt some of the language of anti-immigration that the right was using to fuse that herself onto a kind of capitalist critique. It didn't work. Actually, the opposite worked. The left party sticking to its internationalist guns, sticking to its anti-racism, sticking to its defense of the rights of minorities and foreigners and a belief in the need for valid refugee policy while doing redistribution, that ended up doubling their vote share in the run-up to the recent German election. So I think that if the right and its neoliberal allies claims to care for the population, and that promise is betrayed serially enough, and I think it is and it will be, then I think that's somewhere that a good left populism or a positive version of nationalism, as Anita referred to, could still have some kind of payload as a strategy.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Quinn.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I will bow
hope to
out
see
there,
you
yeah.
again at
Yes.
another internationalist teach-in or at another TNI event. Much appreciated, and thank you for your
Even
time.
in person. What
Even in
about that?
person. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Ciao. Thank you so much.
Gracias.
Yeah. Big thanks to Quinn there. Danielle, let's get back to you. So we've talked about state capitalism. Are there openings in the embrace of state industrial policy that could bring about climate action and a just transition? Like, how do we avoid the extractivist and sometimes neo-colonial approaches that we've seen that many state industries take? How to go about that?
Yes, I would like to comment also on the connection between the far right and neoliberalism, because I think there's a lot to talk about that, but I don't want to spend my 6 minutes. So I will focus on your question about industrial policy. And I coordinate the Global and Green Industrial Policy Lab, and therefore I am very much interested in the research of academic and political debates on industrial development. But I do understand why some activists and researchers from the left and from environmental organizations are worried about such a revival, including some TNI colleagues, because industrial policy can indeed be used to deepen and expand extractivism and neocolonialism as it has happened in the past. But that's not the type of industrial policy we are doing research about or we are supporting. So let's engage in that discussion, starting why the Global South needs industrial policy. I can think of three main reasons. First, the urgency of breaking structural dependencies. The neoliberal idea of comparative advantages has locked the Global South into exporting commodities, resource extraction, and low-value production, perpetuating what Raúl Prebisch and other Latin American economists used to refer as unequal terms of trade. And they have been talking about unequal terms of trade already since the 1940s. We also see the capture of value chain by transnational corporations, which extract surplus value with few and little, if any, benefit for the national economies of the South. So we need a new type of industrial policy. And this also highlights the urgency of breaking the dynamics of capital accumulation that creates self-reinforcing advantages for the core economies of the North. The second reason why I think industrial policy is important, and we need to talk about that, is because of the need of learning from history. Every case of successful industrial development, from the US to Western Europe and from East Asia to China more recently, contradicts free market orthodoxy. Every country that has industrialized has relied on very strong state intervention and coherent and integrated public policies. So, historical precedents demonstrate the crucial necessity of planned state intervention to overcome the peripheral status of Latin America, Africa, and Asia, or most of Asia. Third, the need to address new and urgent challenges. And this is something that Quinn and Anita have already mentioned. The current climate crisis demands a new type of planned transition rather than replicating the carbon-intensive development path of industrial development throughout the 20th century. It is now quite obvious that addressing the global climate emergency requires coordinated response beyond the market solution offered by neoliberalism. Together with another colleague from TNI, Lavinia Steinford, last year we published a report, The Future is Public, and I think it's quite clear now that the future is public, should be public, but should also be green. And the only way to make it green if it's public. So what type of industrial policy the Global South needs? There are many and different definitions of industrial policy that have been proposed by researchers and practitioners from very diverse national and ideological background. But from the perspective of the TNI Green and Global Industrial Policy Lab, industrial policy refers to a set of strategic interventions through which the state deliberately shapes economic production beyond market dictates. rather than merely correcting market failures, as the neoliberals used to propose, transformative and emancipatory industrial policy seeks to redirect investment and production towards economic and social development, regulate capital flows, democratize economic decision-making, and prioritize collective needs and environmental sustainability over private accumulation. So this implies three policy objectives. First, ensuring state ownership and control of a strategic sector. I really recommend a recent book that was published by a Filipino researcher who works both on Asia and Latin America and is working with TNI, supporting our policy lab, Chocho Nem Singh. The title of this book is Business of the State, and he showed the essential importance of the state controlling natural resources, especially in the sector of the so-called critical minerals, in order to think in any possibility of economic emancipation. The second element of public policy that I think we need to discuss is managed trade and production system. I know that some colleagues from the Frontiers of Capital team are here. There was a webinar that TNI organized a few weeks ago in which we talk about the new tariff wars that had been launched by Trump against China, the EU, and almost every other country in the world. I think there's a lot to criticize about that, but we shouldn't forget that this also implies some new opportunities to rethink industrial policy for countries in the global south. I know this can be polemic, and I'm open to discuss it. And the third sector policy area that I think we need to look at is infrastructure and social development. We cannot think of industrial policy as an isolated set of policy intervention. We need to think about industrial policy in relation to public investment in transportation, in energy, in communication. We also need to think about jobs. We need to think about employment. We need to think about skills development, wage policies, and workplace democracy. And obviously, we need to think about ecological planning, targeting renewable energy, infrastructure, and sustainable production system. I have more to say because this is the area I work, but I don't want to exceed my time, so I leave it here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Danielle. And we really, it would be great to have so much more time to go deeper into all of this. But in the chat, we have shared links to some of the work that Danielle does. So if you want to go deeper into that, please check out some of those links, and some of them will be shared in the after email. I'd like to take this moment to really just to remind folks, this is put together by the Transnational Institute, where Danielle works. Anita is an associate, and also with our partners, the Asia-Europe People's Forum, the Alternative Information and Development Center, the Global Network of Movement Lawyers, and NOR. If you really feel compelled, if you're enjoying this content, if you find it useful, please do consider a donation and support for these different organizations that are really working together to try and bring together this very insightful content. And speaking of TNI, I'd like to call in now my colleague, Sofia. Sofia Scasserra is a TNI associate researcher who specializes in digital economy, labor, and development. She's a researcher at the World Labor Institute at, pardon my Spanish, Universidad Nacional 3 de Febrero, UNTREF, in Argentina, and a digital advisor to the International Trade Union Movement. So, Sofia, you've been listening to our discussions here, and I'd like you to really take a moment to root this in your work and in the work you're doing at TNI. Could you reflect on what you've learned, what you've heard in terms of how this debate on neoliberalism impacts your own organizing with labor movements in Latin America and with the global left broadly?
Yeah, thank you, Shaun. Thank you for all these inspiring inputs. Really makes our brain think and get going. And in these dark moments that sometimes we're living as social movements, I was listening carefully, and I love this questioning of, is neoliberalism really still existing? Is it dying? Is it going forward? And if we look at the epistemology of liberalism and neoliberalism and what it really means in terms of economic structure and in terms of policy making and in terms of intellectual movement, as Quinn suggested. I think that neoliberalism is not dead, it's more alive than ever. Especially you can see that through algorithms and the way that algorithms understand the systemic production in the economy and how they allocate resources throughout the economy. You can see how they are programmed, how they are thought, how they are invented. And from its inception, it's printed in the way we code in the big models and the big infrastructures that Anita was mentioning. But sometimes we are overwhelmed by all this, by the far right and the tech oligarchs and all these things. And I come from a country who right now has a terrible government run by Javier Milei, which is like the expression of this Matsheza far right going on. But still, I'm super hopeful. And you asked me about Latin American trade unions and how this this new beginning is being born. And I think that you can see that in trade deals, for instance. I work a lot on trade. And in trade deals, you can see how, for instance, the tech oligarch has been, they have been since 1998 trying to approve the e-commerce program at the WTO that Quinn mentioned so many times in his input. And you can see how they didn't manage to do so. They're still negotiating and they're still trying to pass. And more countries are starting to raise concerns and say, hey, maybe it's not a good idea to liberalize the whole tech and internet. Maybe we should be revising these decisions. And I think that's super hopeful. And in Latin America, for instance, I have Milei's government right now, but you can see how progressive governments are blooming everywhere. You can see them in Mexico, in Colombia, in Chile, in Uruguay, and in so many other countries, in Brazil, having progressive governments. So it's not really true that the far right is rising everywhere. We're just looking at this moment of fracture of the system and how this is a struggle that it's being taking place. And to wrap up this idea, I want to think that this is a moment to reshape institutions. This is a moment to reshape the economy and to reshape institutions. And it's going to matter a lot what we do in the future, what ideas we come to, what struggles do we fight. Because in a moment where everything is questioned, everything can happen. And if we as social movements, we are not aware, that's problematic. But I see a society that is mobilizing in Latin America, trade unions across the globe. I see more internationalism. I mean, trade unions were born as an international movement, and we always have to be aware of that. But they are starting to make even more strategy in international level, and global unions are becoming much more important every time in this new context. And I'm super hopeful of that. The working class uniting together to fight against this. I see that all around the globe, there are ideas emerging, there are struggles, there are fights. And if we see this as a moment of opportunity to really set our agenda in these new institutions that are being born, in this new trade system, in the way that we think about the economy and the policy, in the way that we build industrial policy, I think we have a super bright future going on. So I don't know if that's what I was asked, but I like to have a positive message on how we build this new economy now on, because it's really easy to get stuck on like the genocide in Gaza and the environment crisis that we're facing and the tech oligarchs and the far right. But the truth is that if you look at how social movements are reorganizing and they're reuniting and they're becoming an international movement, we have always been, but we are even stronger in that way. You can see that there's hope there to reshape these institutions in a moment where everything is questioned. So that's what I like to pick up from what the speakers have been said. And I think it's important to live with that idea of what are we going to do to take this forward as social movements from now on, and not so much stay on the horrible things that we're living in this very moment.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sophia. And that is very much in the spirit of what this series is about, to say we see fractures, we see changes, there's a reconfiguration happening, and indeed it's got so many negative ramifications, but at the same time, those fractures are letting in some light and are creating opportunities to rethink and to come up with new things that can actually lead us to a global global justice and equity. And I think this sets up a great segue to the question that we got in the Q&A that I would like to pose to you, Anita. Sebastian Walker-Young, who's a guest here, just asked, what would make a bigger difference in overcoming oligarchy in democratic republics? Is it campaign finance reform? Do we nationalize social media, the digital public square? Or nationalizing AI and other digital public goods? What's your take on that? 2 to 3 minutes, not a long answer. Thank you.
I think there are many kinds of strategies in the quiver of different nation states, right? I mean, you have to begin with what you have. And to that extent, I do think that all these strategies are particularly important. Public finance remains a very, very big question mark. So it almost seems like a non-starter when we're actually talking about global questions of debt. Which brings me to the important aspect of looking at redistribution. And Shaun, what were the other two options that were offered? The first was public finance, and the second was, no, you're muted. Nationalizing. You're muted. I can't hear you. Hello.
Apologies. The question was, there's a differentiation between the social media and public sphere,
yes,
and AI and other digital public goods. Do we nationalize either of those?
Absolutely. So I think that lots of scholars, I think, who've been studying the communication sphere have been suggesting that we do need to have a public social media as an alternative. Others have been saying that we need to nationalize it. But I think the question remains of how you will make content governance accountable and what you would do to rein in algorithms, right? So the virality of the algorithm and the way in which we are trying to make it accountable in the public sphere is actually the question. One of the cases in the US Supreme Court is really about Google. It's about separating the search function from the ad function. And that kind of breaking up big tech, I think, is a very important strategy, which finally brings me to the most important thing. And I think we do need to start thinking in terms of public AI. And this is extremely vital. And we can think about this in various ways. And I think different countries and different communities and different subnational units can think about public AI in various ways. A small initiative that we are associated with is to look at public educational institutions in one state in India and to work with them in order to set up a data trust of data of school children. And this data trust will be co-managed and co-owned by communities, school management system, and the state. So the school at the local level, the parent community, as well as the state will co-manage that data. And so I do think that insights, inferences, and projections and modeling will be done by that community so that the data remains, and the insights from the data and the intelligence from the data remains local. Accountability remains local and control remains local. So I do think that the question of public AI is indeed quite important, and it's not futuristic. It must happen now.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And now to Danielle and Sophia, I'll ask variations of a very much similar question about the agency, right? For you, Danielle, Steve Lawless in the Q&A asked, who will build an alternative to neoliberalism? And maybe I'll ask you, so who does this? Who builds this alternative? And coming at it from the perspective of the working people also. And if also you say state capitalism may not necessarily be the best way to go about this, I don't want to complicate the question, but the question really is, who's going to do it? And do you have any examples of people that you're seeing building alternatives to neoliberalism?
Yes, I was looking at the chat because there are some very interesting comments about the significance of public alternatives. Then I would also like to comment on that if there is time. But focusing on the issue of agency, I think we need to work simultaneously in 3 areas. The first one is quite obvious for people working for TNI or related to TNI. It would mean building political power. This implies popular mobilization of workers, peasant, and progressive intellectuals around developmental alternatives. And this is already happening. There are many affected communities around the world, especially affected by mining, who obviously are focusing on the right to say no, and we need to respect that, and we need to support those struggles. But there are some other organizations who are not only thinking about how to resist, but also how to develop proposals. And there are many examples of that kind of alternatives. I would like to mention, for instance, the work of the trade unions for energy democracy to it, who have done wonderful work rethinking the meaning of public and reconceptualizing the idea of public ownership. I think we also need a new type of democratic developmental state, balancing planning effectiveness with accountability to popular sectors. I think the old ideas that we used to have about the developmental state are no longer viable. I remember when I was doing my PhD at the ISS in The Hague, we used to read a lot about the developmental state. Those readings are not that old, but much of that literature is no longer relevant. And this implies also knowledge decolonization of knowledge, developing economic thinking rooted in global South experience. I think this would imply less consultancy fees for people like Mariana Mazzucato, for instance, and more reliance on the wonderful research center and public universities that we already have in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, and who are already working on alternatives grounded in the specific social and economic realities of this country. And we also need a strategic international engagement. We need to build counter-hegemonic alliances, building South cooperation network. And I noted that in the chat, some people refer to the death of José Pepe Mujica, the former president of Uruguay, which happened yesterday. And one of the big ideas that we need to remember from Pepe Mujica's political life and work is his constant insistence on the need for regional cooperation and South-South integration and cooperation. I think we really need that. And that's very much needed if we think about how to renegotiate trade agreements to challenge the restriction on policy space imposed by the WTO and the powerful governments and corporate lobbies of the global north. And we also need a strategic engagement exploiting the growing contradiction between competing imperialist power. I already mentioned the Trump tariff war as an opportunity. And finally, related to the first point, we need to create solidarity network. We need more coordination between progressive social and political organizations, civil society organizations, located both in the north and in the south. We need more cooperation among progressive and left researchers. That's the kind of work that we try to support from the Global Green Industrial Policy Lab at TNI, for instance. And we need more South knowledge exchange and technology sharing. So I guess I didn't say anything original, but sometimes it's useful to remind these ideas that we already know, but we don't talk very often about them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Danielle. And maybe a similar question to you, Sophia, in terms of like agency. You work with trade unions. How about engaging tech workers to change the purpose of AI and building alternatives? Do we have any examples of that? Is it a feasible idea to think of? I think linking also with what Anita mentioned about having public AI. What would be your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's already happening, and that's one of the points where I'm standing in being hopeful. For instance, in Latin America, we have a lot of trade unions that represent workers working in computing science and in programming. And those trade unions are working on alternatives, and they're working also in building software tools to empower trade unions. So there's a big community of cooperatives that are also working on alternatives and are also working in digital tools to serve institutions like trade unions and social movements and organizations that they need solutions to organize the society. And this is already happening. This is not something new. It's something that has had, it's a process that started a few years ago, and it's growing a lot. So that brings me hope in the sense of I see the society that is mobilized and a society that is really trying to figure out a solution to bring up these alternatives. And a final comment that I want to make also is the disaster that cryptocurrencies are doing around the world and are doing in Argentina and in Latin America. With this, it's going to become a battleground. And I think the feminist movement has a lot to do in that, because cryptocurrencies and the crypto world is navigating through a really machist environment, but there are women that are already programming inside the ecosystem of cryptocurrencies and blockchain, and they're making alternatives technologies to what it's already happening inside the crypto world. And this type of resistance, I think they are the resistance that we need to look not as only a resistance that it's there holding it together to try to keep on going, but as projects that are really growing and that are really thinking about how to think these new technologies in an alternative way. And this is already happening. We just need to look for them and invest our time and energy to work with them and to unite the progressive forces around the world to think about this. And because the alternatives, as Danielle Chavez mentioned, they're already there. There are people who are already there thinking about this.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much, Sophia. Hope is what we need right now. I see we're running out of time, and so I'll just give each of you just 1 minute, one sentence to say where you're seeing the light coming from in this particular moment of fracture in neoliberalism. An inspiring story, an inspiring occurrence that you've seen, a group of people that are doing something amazing that you think people should pay attention to. Just 1 minute before we wrap up. Let's start with you, Anita. I'll put you on the spot. Please unmute yourself. Yes.
Yeah, Shaun, just say that again.
Where are the fractures? Where is the light coming in from in this moment with fractures in the neoliberal order? An inspiring story, people that are doing something amazing that you think we should pay attention to. Just in a sentence, in less than a minute.
I think that what's happening actually in terms of the bridging between digital rights activism and traditional rights activism is very, very inspiring. The fact that people who've been looking at biodiversity, people who've been looking at food sovereignty, labor rights activists, environmental rights activists, and anti-financialization movements, all of these are coming together to say that the tech agenda is ours. And that, I think, is extremely inspiring.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Danielle, where's the light coming from?
Yes, I'm a big fan of Leonard Cohen. And he say there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And in my case, when I look for the light, I look for people working in the areas I'm interested on. which are public ownership, public services, industrial policies. And I see a lot of light in the sense of an increasing number of activists and organizations working around the idea of public ownership. There's a whole revival of the idea of public ownership. It began during COVID. I guess you all remember that. So many reference to the need for the state to play a bigger role, including renationalization or nationalization. Then we had a sort of comeback of neoliberalism for some years. But that movement for fighting for the public never died. And I think now is stronger than ever. And we see a very interesting convergence of very different organizations. Some of them were not used to working together before. For instance, in some countries, there was a big separation between the struggles of trade unions and the struggles of environmental organizations. But the fight for public services, the fight for public ownership is an idea that can unify all these forces. And I think that's a really big and shiny and bright light.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Danielle. And Sofia, your positivity is much appreciated. Give us one last burst of it. I'd like to hear from you. Where's the light coming from?
The light is coming from here, right now. We organized a webinar on Wednesday. It's Wednesday at sometime during the day, and we had almost 175 people logged in just to think about how we can beat this system up. And I think that's the light. That's the light. If you think about it, it's a lot of people, 175 people trying to think an alternative and trying to think how to get away with this. And it's a lot of people around the globe thinking and trying to fight back. And I don't see we're really far away of uniting and really getting the power back. I don't see that really far away. They are fracturing, they are breaking down. The far right is having internal issues by itself. We have to take the opportunity to keep on doing that fracture and rise up like the flower on our beautiful image at TNI. So yeah, that's the light right here, right now.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Indeed, we are our own liberators, and together we can make it. Thank you so much to our panelists for this super insightful conversation. Much appreciated. Thanks also to Quinn, who couldn't be here till the end of our conversation. And thank you for all the people who have joined from all over the world. Big thanks to Nick Buxton, Jess Graham, the entire TNI machine who brought this together. Big thank you to all our co-organizers who have worked together to bring this webinar together. Please do consider a donation to the Transnational Institute, to NOR, to AIDC, to the APF, to the global global network of movement lawyers. This webinar has been recorded and will be posted to all of those who registered, along with the digest of the session, also with the links that came up in the chat. We would really love your feedback, so please fill in the survey. It helps us do things better. It's the only way we can improve, to hear from you what your experience has been. Make sure to fill in the survey and let us know what you think we can do better. We've got an amazing panel next week, so spread the word, tell your friends. We're exploring why the far right is succeeding in this particular fractured moment, and we'll be delving a bit deeper into their agenda, how do they achieve their success, but also their fractures that we can use to defeat them. Our speakers will include Joe Mullo, who's a research director at Hope Not Hate and author of Drums in the Distance, Journeys into the Global Far Right. Aileen Torres Santana, associate researcher at the International Research Group on Authoritarianism and Counter Strategies, and editor of Rights at Risk in Latin America, 11 Studies of Neoconservative Groups, published in 2020. We've got Rakib Hamid Naik, executive director of the Center for the Study of Organized Hate, and it will be co-moderated by our teaching series partner, Noor. So this is going to be a really great session. Please support us, help us put more of this content out. And indeed, we are our own liberators, folks. We're the Davids to this Goliath. Thank you.